Well, I'm going to give you a chance to ask some questions if we have them. So if you got them as you go along, just yell at me. We want to talk a little bit about bees and pollination, which is a pretty big topic nowadays. I am also a beekeeper. I teach or have taught beekeeping at Purdue many times over the years. And this is an issue we get asked about quite a lot, and especially relative to gardening. And I've got to tell you right off that I do quite a bit of gardening myself and have a little bit of an orchard there and things. And so my bees are real close. My honeybees are real close to our garden plants and things. And I'll tell you some stories about that as we go along. But I want to kind of give you a little bit of the scientific background. Again, yell at me as we go along. This idea of pollen's the word, spread it around. Some of you may remember Elmo there, but what this really is known as in biology, and what I teach our ecology classes, this in biology is known as mutualism. That relationship between the plants and the pollinators, and there's been a long history of this, and I thought you might enjoy a little bit of hearing what I teach the ecology students relative to mutualism. So that's what we call it. Another way to look at it, this is really a love story. It's a love story between the flowers, if you want to pluralize it, and the bees, in this case, the honeybees. And there's been a long coevolutionary process that's called classic coevolution between the blooming plants and the pollinators. So I teach the ecology kids what it is that happens in this coevolution. I thought you might be interested in that, and then we'll talk about how it may relate to all of us as gardeners along the way. So here's the deal. Once upon a time, it sounds like an old story you've read to your kids. Once upon a time, there was an old insect, and it was probably a beetle. At least that's what ecologists think is the case. And that beetle discovered that plant pollen is a great food. Now, we argue that there's a lot of reasons for that, that those beetles, these organisms we call beetles today, have chewing mouth parts. And so back in the history of when the insects were coming on the earth, plants were already here, they were obviously using wind pollination or other things, but those chewing mouth parts were just perfect to eat pollen. One of the other courses I teach at Purdue is called Insects in Prose and Poetry. So we look at the literary side of incorporating insects. An old poet by the name of Ogden Nash, he said, "Some primeval termite knocked on wood and tasted it and found it good. And that is why your cousin May fell through the kitchen floor today." So he's talking about the food habits of a termite, and that they are able to eat wood, and he's relating it to your cousin May and the kitchen floor. So that's kind of what we're talking about. How did insects get their food habits? How did that relationship between plants really evolve over the years? So let me give you the kind of the two sides of it. This is kind of the executive summary. If you look at the plant side, there are several things that had to happen before we got insects to become the pollinators. One is that they have colors and scents associated with the flowers on the plants, and they have landing pads. In other words, if an insect is going to come to that flower to pollinate, or to get the pollen, to pollinate that plant, it's got to be able to land. And actually, it turns out insects are kind of dumb, and so the plants actually give them directions. In other words, they have signs, and the goodies are down here. Now, when you look at a plant, you don't see that. You know, we look at a plant and think, what beautiful flowers that are on there. And my students, I say, you know, all you women in my class, I say, if you've ever got a flower from your boyfriend or something, you think that flowers are there for we humans, but they're not. We humans have just discovered that they're pretty and we can take advantage of them. They have the guide. So if you look at flowers, if you look at them, we see a flower that looks something like this, but insects don't see colors. Now we think they do, because you know we see them around all these yellow and red flowers, but for the most part, they don't see colors. They see an ultraviolet spectrum. And so what the insect sees from this plant is this. So they see the ultraviolet. And if you look at it, here is where the good spot is. And if you look at the petals of the plant, you actually see lines that are directing them down into where the nectaries of the flower really are. So when the insect lands on it, it's saying, down here is the good stuff, right? So every flower you look at, if you take a picture of it in the ultraviolet, you'll see lines directing the insects down to where the nectaries really are. And the flower has to have structure to get the pollen on the insect. Now when you think about this, the insect doesn't come to the flower just because the flower is pretty. We'll give those to our girlfriends or our wives along the way. Insects have to be bribed to come to that flower. So the flower gives them a little sip of nectar. And that bribes the insect, because they have learned if you go to that flower, you're going to get a food source. You're going to get something that's good. So give them a little sip. Now you can't, if you're a flower, you can't give them so much nectar that they fill up and go back to their home. Because what's the goal of giving them nectar? Have them carry pollen, right, to another plant. So what you got to do if you're a plant, if you think about what the management would be, you give them enough nectar so that they come to that plant, enough that they want to go there, but not enough so that they go home, so that they go to another plant, and another plant, and another plant to fill up. And when they do that, what happens? The plant is designed in such a way, when the insect gets in there, it crawls down to get down to where the nectaries are down here, and the anthers that are holding the pollen, you got to crawl by. So if you're putting out nectar for the insects, you have to be putting out the pollen so it gets on the insect. So once they crawl down there, they get it covered up. Now the insects bring the pollen back and eat it. They bring the nectar back to make it into honey or to feed it to, normally it's pollen feeders that we think of in terms of pollination. So this is sort of from the plant side. If you look at it from the insect side, the insects need to have this sort of an adaptation. They need really to, they have to use pollen and nectar as food. And that's the reason they're coming to the flower. They need to provision their nest with food for their young. It's not just enough for them to come to that flower and eat the pollen or eat the nectar. They want to take it back to their nest to feed their young. And that's how you get continuous pollination going on. And in order to get pollen on them, they have to be hairy. They have to have hairy bodies. I tell our students, you can tell a wasp, generally, which is a predator and eats other insects and things, or spiders. You can tell them from a bee in that wasps are clean shaven. They're slick bodied. But you look at the bees, they're fuzzy. They got hair all over them, and that hair is there to get the pollen stuck on them. So when they get that pollen, then they can take it off, put it on their in their pollen basket on their leg, or some of them just carry it back and then shove and use it when they get back to the nest, and they feed it to their offspring. And they have to have sucking mouths. They got to be able to suck up the nectar. So that original chewing beetle maybe discovered that pollen was good to eat, and maybe was carrying some pollen from flower to flower, but they have not evolved to become real good pollinators, but they're probably the ancestral pollinators. So they also need wings, because if you're going to go out to a flower and carry the pollen to flower, you don't want to have to be walking on 6 legs from one flower to the other. The beetles would have to do that. So you've got the insects that are pollinators, all are winged. It's not totally true, but if you look at all the pollinators, the bats, some of the hummingbirds do a little of this. Pretty rare compared to the insects, but everything has wings, so they can get from one flower to the other. So there you've got the plant side and the insect side. If you look at the insect pollinators, there are lots of them out there. This is the point I want you guys to take home with you. There are lots of the Apis species, Mellifera, which is our European honeybee, Serrana dorsata, Florea. These are all honeybee species. The ones that we normally have here are Apis. And by the way, if you didn't know this, there's no extra cost for this. The name Apis for the honeybee, it's its generic name, its genus name, Apis mellifera. If you look at it, mellifera literally is the old Latin term that means bee. And anybody named Melissa, you're named after the bee. You're a bee, you know. And so anybody, Melissa, you say, oh, nice name. Same name as the honeybee. It's the same, but Apis is the bull god of ancient Egypt. And you're going, what? Why did you name the honeybee the bull god? Well, more than you want to know probably, but for years and years, humans didn't understand where honeybees came from. That was before they understood metamorphosis in insects. And that's when spontaneous generation, they thought stuff just emerged from the soil of the Nile and things like that. They didn't know where the honeybee came from, and they inappropriately, it's called the begonia myth. Begonia literally means sort of bull born, if you would. They thought that honeybees came from the dead carcass of an ox or a cow. But they made a real mistake. The mistake was that what was in the body of the cow or the ox were actually bee mimics called droneflies, and their larvae fed in the body of the cow, and the ancient people would see, and they even had data on it, take a cow and they would kill it. In those days, if you want good honeybees, take a cow, kill it, put it in a building, and in a week you will have little larvae, little worms in it, and in 3 weeks you'll have bees. And they believed that the best bees came from an ox, not from a donkey or something like that. So we will say, well, these aren't very good bees. It probably came from the carcass of a donkey. You got the good ones from the carcass of an ox. And so Linnaeus, who named this insect, basically knew that history, and so he then said, okay, we'll name it Apis, after the Egyptian bull god, based on the begonia myth that honeybees come from the carcass of an ox. But it is messing up an insect, and the dronefly, and if I had these pictures I'd show you, I showed in fact the class today, they look just alike, and for most people, when you look at them, you wouldn't know that unless you count the wings, because the bee only has 2 and the honeybee has 4, but when you see them, you'd think they're the same thing. So the ancient people messed it up, and they thought that's where honeybees came from. Well, we have all kinds of other bees, the stingless bees, the bumblebees, what we call the alkali bees, what we call the scolids, the andrenid bees, all these, the halictids, all of these, the syrphids, those are flies, but all of these are insect pollinators. And you may get mad at me, but what my general feeling is that most of the pollination in our gardens is done not by honeybees, but it's done by all these other little bees. Some of them you wouldn't even recognize probably. I see people who'll see them and say, oh, look at that little gnat. No, that's a tiny bee, and they are great pollinators. I just came back and led a tour down in Costa Rica for a couple weeks ago, and we saw little bitty orchid flowers that were like this. And there were tiny ants. There's an ant pollinator that were the pollinators of that little bitty flower, you know. So the little flowers out there, these are tiny pollinators, and they are taking the pollen back, feeding it to their offspring. And if you look in here, there are carpenter bees and other things as well. All of them are pollinators. Yeah?
Which category is the mason bee pollen?
What category?
Yeah, what category is the mason bee pollen?
Well, the mason bees are, well, it depends on what you want to call them, but they're one of what we call the alkali type bees right here. Generally just a grouping. We call them mason bees because they build stuff, but a lot of the pollination of orchard plants now, we talk about actually establishing the mason bees and putting out nest form and things. So, you hear a lot about mason bees nowadays because you can kind of commercially raise them, and you can actually buy them and get for your pollination. So the point is, there are over 20,000 species of bees. Most of them are solitary. They aren't social. There aren't colonies of them. They live in single nests. The female makes herself, and she cares for all of her offspring. And all of these pollinators, the alfalfa pollinators, some of them that we use are all solitary type bees. And I'll show you here in a second, they're not the social insects. So, what determines bee success for you? Now here's, I think, what all of us need to think about as gardeners. What determines any insect success will be, first is food. The second thing would be living space. In other words, is there a place for them to make a home? Now what I'll show you in a minute is that many gardeners that are serious about this are putting out nesting sites for some of these pollinating bees, those that are in straws or they used to be in holes drilled in the wood in the old posts, and those things are gone now. So you can put out these nesting wood blocks, and you'll get a lot of these solitary bees nesting in those sites, and next year you'll have a lot of their offspring come out, and they'll do your pollination. Well, the other thing when you talk about bee success is competition. And you may not want to hear this, and I think I mentioned it later on, but basically, honeybees are not a native insect. Honeybees were introduced into this country. So they're an introduced insect. They came over on some of the early ships along with the cattle and the other stuff and were introduced here. And the Native Americans had never seen honeybees. And they didn't recognize them. So the Native Americans called honeybees white man's flies because they had never seen them. But they quickly learned that the honey was really good. So they adapted the what do you call it, fruit of the hive very quickly, but they had never seen them. And so the only sweets that the Native Americans knew basically was maple sugar kind of stuff, which they were using in those days. But bumblebees do make honey, and I'll show you in a little bit. They don't make a lot. So, but they call them white man's flies. And interestingly, right here in Indiana, the Native Americans predicted the arrival of white settlers, not the white people, because they had seen the white people coming through. These were the trappers and the early people. But the settlers, they predicted, were going to arrive in Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, by the arrival of the honeybees, because the honeybees actually, by swarming, preceded most of the white settlers across the Midwest part here, because they were swarming and going further west. When the Native Americans saw that the bees were there, they said, oh, it won't be long, there'll be white settlers. And they predicted within 4 to 5 years, once they saw honeybees, that white settlers would be coming through. And so they knew kind of what that relationship would be. The other thing that determines bee success are inimical or organisms that kill them or harm them. Biological organisms, there are parasites on the bees and everything else, just like we'll talk about in honeybees, have these inimical organisms there. Also, weather is fairly important to their survival, primarily when they're out trying to collect nectar and collect pollen. People ask me this time of year, oftentimes in the press, they will say, what is the winter, whether it's mild or whether it's cold, done to the insect populations? And my facetious answer always is, insects have been around for 250 million years. What I'm going to predict, that this is not the winter that kills them. And so technically, they're adapted, at least those that survive in our area, are adapted to survive the winter. So it's very difficult. Well, I tell people, the winter itself is probably not going to be real harmful to the insect populations. What's probably more harmful is when they come out of hibernation and start going out to lay eggs, to mate, and if you got weather that gets really cold at that time, they're no longer going to not be harmed by the cold weather or the rain. So probably what happens in late April and May and June may be a lot more important to insect populations than what happened back in January and December. So I always answer that question. I said, if you can tell me, if the meteorologist can tell me what the weather's going to be in May and June, I can give you a pretty good estimate of whether or not insects are going to be successful in getting going and have big populations. But since meteorologists aren't real good at forecasting that far ahead, then I can't say it either. But the point is, they will survive, and if we got good reproductive weather, don't have a lot of them killed by rain and all that stuff, we could have really high populations. Now typically we answer this question when people ask us that. Well, I guarantee you there are going to be a couple things next year. You're going to have mosquitoes. Guarantee you'll have those. Regardless of what happens. Probably going to have some ladybugs, different species. They're going to crawl into your house. And if you're in an area where we have the marmorated stink bug, you're probably going to have some of those. But if you want to ask me, are you going to have a lot of corn borer? Back in the days before we had genetically modified corn, I couldn't say really. It depends on what happens when that first brood of moths are flying around and whether they're able to lay eggs. So the other thing are insecticides. Any insect is going to be affected by insecticides, and all of us that are beekeepers are really concerned when we see planes flying over because there's drift, and now we know that the seed treaters and things have all been shown to be a lot more harmful to the honeybees, and I thought they were going to be. I thought seed treaters were going to have the stuff in the ground. It wasn't going to be much of a problem, but we're getting enough dust flying off of there that we're ending up killing a lot of honeybees. And the product that we're using is very, very toxic. And so it doesn't take much. If 1 or 2 bees on a dandelion beside the field where we're planting gets some of that pollen that's contaminated, and unfortunately, they can get back to the hive with it, and it doesn't take more than a couple or 3 bees to start carrying a little bit back to the hive, and we get the hive to be destroyed. So it's not quite like just closing them up when the plane's going over. If I know they're spraying something in our area, if they let me know, I'll close the hives so they don't fly during that day. And that's what we'll talk about, how as gardeners we can spray insecticides and minimize the bee part. Let's talk a little bit about the success of these colonies, just because it kind of relates to all the stuff we see going on in terms of economics. The success of a honeybee colony is really the survival of the colony to the next season, because there are no individual honeybees out there. So this is an organism, depends on the success of the colony. How do they reproduce their colonies? They have swarms that go out. They try to establish a new colony. And what I tell people is that that's the reason that honeybees, and bumblebees are likely to do so too, but honeybees have an interesting stinging behavior, as most of you have been around honeybees. When a honeybee stings, she leaves her stinger in your arm, because it's stuck, it's that fishhook kind of thing on the end. And if you've been stung by a honeybee, you know that the stinger's there and it continues, the muscles continue to contract and force poison into your skin. So usually we tell people to pull the sting out as soon as you can. You see it there, pull it out. And that will reduce the dosage of poison you get. So take that out of there quickly. But when she stings, she gives her life for the colony. There's only one other animal on earth that will give their life for the good of the colony. Who? Yeah, humans. Only humans send our people out to defend our society or our colony. We call it the military war, right? Honeybees do it by sending their guards out, and they'll sting, and they give their life. Interestingly, if you get stung by one, she loses her stinger. She'll still buzz around you and act like she's going to sting you, but she can't. But the difference between humans, at least it used to be the difference, women won't get mad at me, the difference between humans and the honeybees is that the honeybees send their old women to war. Because it's the oldest ones, the fielders that are the oldest ones, and they're the ones that defend the hive and go out. So the honeybees send their old women. We as humans tended to send our young men, and now our young people for the most part, and the generals sit back and say, go, right? The old geezers aren't over there much anymore, but we send the young people to do our fighting, where the bees send their old women. And I suspect if we humans start sending our old women to war, wars would end pretty quickly. I mean, they probably would stop that. But so the success of the colony is how honeybees measure their success. If you've got a swarm and it gets established, that's good. On the other hand, the success of the solitary bees and the bumblebees is the survival of individual females to the next year. So if you were in charge of a honeybee colony, you ask them, how much honey do we have? Because to survive to the next season, you've got to have enough food to feed them all year long. And we've discovered that we steal. They make more than they need, so we take it from them. And one of the things that causes a problem with some beekeepers, and you get a warm winter, then they've taken too much of the food away from them, and the bees end up starving. And unless you're watching it real carefully, if you got a warm winter, they're using a lot of honey because they're flying around. Even this year, the last count I had, my bees flew 35 days this year when they normally wouldn't fly from December through this time of year. 35 days they're out flying around. Now they are bringing back a little pollen, but up to then they were flying around and there was nothing out there. But what were they doing? They were using energy, and they were not forming their cluster properly when they got back. If you had a fairly cold day the next day, then the brood that they were establishing was likely to chill, and at some point they're going to cause the colony to die and be lost. So warm weather can be very detrimental to a honeybee colony during the winter months. During the summer, it's obviously not a problem. So the solitary bees, you got to have a lot of females, because the bumblebees, what they do in the fall, they switch and produce a lot of queens and send them out, and they mate. They produce males and the females. They mate. Then the queens then start the colony in the spring. That's what you'll see very soon here. You'll see big old queen bumblebees flying around. They're going buzzing around, looking in places, going in hay bales, trying to find a place to establish their nest. So for the bumblebees and all the other solitary bees, you got to produce a lot of queens that will survive the winter if that species is going to continue. For honeybees, you got to produce a colony